Topic 1.5, state building in Africa. So we're continuing on to our next region of Unit 1. And so for today, the essential question is, to what extent was the state building in Africa, kingdoms and empires, similar to during the period of 1200 to 1450 CE? So I'm not asking to compare it to other regions, just to the civilizations and kingdoms that we are talking about within Africa today. So look for those similarities and differences, and then think about to what extent. Is it to a high extent they're similar, to a low extent, to a medium extent, whatever. So think about that as we go along. So the context for today, by 1000, sub-Saharan Africa had essentially adopted agriculture, and means that they had like ability to create surplus, and they were tapped into a lot of these trade networks, including the Indian Ocean Trade Network, which we'll talk about a little bit, as well as these trans-Saharan trade networks too. Islam, which it comes around in mid 7th century, is going to spread into Africa, North Africa to start with, but also find its ways into West Africa and even along the East African coast too. So Islam is being introduced into this continent where Christianity already had some influence in some areas in Africa. But by and large, the majority of the religious beliefs prior to the introduction of Islam were mostly, how do I put this, animal veneration, animism, and shamanism, the kind of the major religions, ethnic religions that are in Africa. So the kin-based networks were very common in Africa during this time. This is where families govern themselves, right? So you don't have these large-scale empires, and you will see some we talk about today, but much of Africa has kind of adopted this kin-based network system and so forth, and the families govern themselves and kind of take care of their own in that sense, right? There's usually a male chief who handles conflicts if within the family. The groups of villagers become districts as a result of that, and then villagers would conflict over resources from time to time altogether. But this represents a decentralized government for the most part. And we're going to look at some examples that counter the decentralized government that you'll find in Africa and a lot of places. And there are some pretty advanced civilizations that do pop up in Africa during this time period. Okay, so the language of the curriculum in Africa, as in Eurasia and the Americas, state systems demonstrated continuity, innovation, diversity, and expanded in scope and reach. So let's break it down to some specific examples, okay? So the first one is the Hausa Kingdom. The Hausa Kingdoms were made up of, it's basically an ethnic group that's made up of 7 different states that are found mostly in modern-day Nigeria. And using that kin-based network, they've kind of created these kingdoms amongst themselves. So it's extremely decentralized governments. Even though they are culturally and language-wise very connected to each other, politically they are not. They are kingdoms that sometimes will compete over resources and also over trade too, control of trade or access to trade in the South. So they are going to benefit a lot from the trans-Saharan trade networks that you'll see on this map here. These networks are able to go across the Saharan desert. We'll talk more about the trans-Saharan deserts and trans-Saharan trade network in a later unit. But just know that they're highly connected to these regions that connect to the Mediterranean and so forth. So they do get access to some goods. And so some of the things that are found in sub-Saharan Africa, such as gold, ivory, salt, make their way northward. Islam is going to be introduced into these kingdoms roughly around the 14th century. And that does change things, and you'll start to see some empires that build up around these regions, not entirety, but they'll include parts of the Hausa kingdoms. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the political structures of West and East Africa. They do increase as the exchange of goods brings more wealth and thus more power to wealthy families. And also increases cultural diversity because we see the movement of people as well as ideas that get introduced into West Africa. That goes both ways, right? Islam it basically spreads to this part, and then to make it more attractive to the people, a lot of the Islamic beliefs kind of blend with a lot of the animism and Christianity that sometimes existed there already. And so we do see a more unique version of Islam, a unique practice of Islam in these parts of the world comparatively to where you find Islam in, say, the Abbasid Caliphate. So that's something that is worth noting as well. So there were four major kingdoms. We're going to talk about each one: Ghana, Mali, Zimbabwe, and Ethiopia that existed in Africa during this time. So let's start with Ghana. So Ghana is pretty much in West Africa. It's founded around the 5th century, but it really peaks somewhere between the 8th and 11th century. And the rulers of Ghana, had extremely a large amount of resources that they could trade that were highly demanded in other parts of the world, in particular gold, ivory, and then to a lesser extent, copper, clothes, and tools that they can get. So the salt, I can't tell you how much salt is an importance of a commodity. It was highly desired. Think about what salt is used for. I mean, it's an essential element to the human body, number one, but it also helps preserve meat and other things. So salt was a really highly demanded commodity that you could find here in West Africa. The capital city of Ghana was Kumbai Sali. And then considering we're talking about a lot of Africa where this kinship or kin-based system, this is a very decentralized government, and where there's clear leaders and bureaucracy that organized to help for the benefit of trade, but also to help expand territory and protect territory. And their military was pretty well advanced for the region as they were using iron weapons that they had built themselves, right? Now, over time, empires fall, and here comes a new one that kind of replaces Ghana, and that's Mali Empire, which kind of comes around by the 12th century. And the just like Ghana, they were a very powerful trading society. They thrive on that gold trade. But this one is a little different because it is founded based off of Islamic principles and such. And the founder themselves was a Muslim ruler named Sudanta. And I'm not sure I had that pronunciation correct. But they used the Islamic connection to help establish trade, because like the Islamic world, as vast as it was, if you were connected into those trade networks, it's quite a benefit, and the word of mouth spreads of what's there, and so you have merchants come out, and of course the merchants bring more commodities, they bring more religion and other things, right? So on the cultural landscape of this region, you can still find one of the most impressive buildings in the world, and unique ones, and that's the Great Mosque of Djenné. And this is this mud brick looking building here. And this every year, probably more than once a year, they redress this. And so they bring mud from the river and so forth, and then they kind of coat it off again. And they just make sure that this stays preserved for all time if they can. But this mosque, it becomes a cultural center of Islam. And so much like where we talk about the House of Wisdom, this one is a big community center that have scholars, intellectuals, and people of the faith gather together in exchange of ideas. Mosques themselves are really just cultural centers and gathering community centers and such. Different than what we kind of think of. I mean, they're used for prayer as well, but they're different than the way we think of churches in the West, particularly Christian churches. But this building itself is still around, and it's protected by the World Heritage. World Heritage. I'm forgetting the last part of that thing, but yes. So And Mali is a pretty powerful empire, but one of the most famous people from Mali was the king Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was probably the richest man in history. And I've linked a little video on this Canvas page to give you like a little extra information about him. But he is going to be the ruler of Mali. And he promoted the building of a learning center in Timbuktu in Africa. You can see here on the map right here. And that becomes another kind of center of Islamic trade and exchange of culture and ideas. He himself goes on the Hajj, the pilgrimage that is kind of expected of somebody who's capable as one of the 5 pillars of the Muslim faith or the Islamic faith. And so on his Hajj, he won in style. And so he basically, gathered all his wealth and resources, all the people who worked for him, and they went on this tour. And it was kind of like the whole "look how wealthy I am" tour as I go on Hajj. And he was like, rolling down the streets of Cairo, just throwing gold coins at people, so much so that it actually led to an economic collapse because it created so much inflation because he was just giving out all of this free money. It's a interesting story, but that's the wealthiest man in history was a king from Africa named Mansa Musa. So the next civilization we're going to talk about is Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe, the Great Zimbabwe, was established in the 9th century in East Africa. And you can see here on the map, if I can get myself out of the way here, here on the map you see where the Great Zimbabwe is. And it's in relative closeness to the east coast of Africa. And that's essentially important because they're going to be connected into this trade network. They are more in the interior, so they have access to a lot of resources in the interior, but they would bring them to the coast to where they could trade and then get stuff from the Indian Ocean trade network, and then they would bring it back here, right? And so you'll find stuff in Great Zimbabwe like porcelain from China. So they very much were connected to these trade networks. So even in the interior of Africa, the trade networks find a way to get the commodities to people in different parts of the world. But itself, it's kind of known for this great stone structure that was built in the Great Zimbabwe. And it was, this very large stone wall that they built without mortar. Mortar being like the stuff that connects the stones. The stones just were like perfectly fitted and carved and shaped to fit each other. And it was essentially a kind of a protective place for the people to go to if they were under attack. And so the roughly 20,000 people lived there in the 15th century. For Africa, of a city that size, was pretty impressive. People were generally more spread out because there was awful lot of land to be able to spread out too. Eventually it gets abandoned because of overgrazing, and so you have environmental determination that happens as a result of overgrazing their cattle and such, and so it ends up getting abandoned. At its height, here's what it looked like as far as artist's rendition of it. And then this area right here, this hill, this is where the wealthy and the royal families lived, was on this hill. And then this was used kind of as protection against any attacks. But then you had all these little houses on the outside here. All right, now we're going to switch over to Ethiopia, and then also it's known as Axum. And Ethiopia, Axum, they were unique compared to a lot of places in Africa. So Christianity, because of their relative closeness to the Middle East and to Europe, Christianity and Christian missionaries spread Christianity down to Axum right around the 1st century. So not long after the death of Christ, and we're talking about relative terms to history. And so it was a legit Christian civilization as a result, and they have a unique brand of Christianity compared to like Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, the major branches. But then this Christianity is still embraced in the in Ethiopia today. When Islam shows up in the 7th century, it does kind of weaken the Christian influence over that territory, but it still very much stays alive and is around today. They develop a very independent version of Christianity from Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox, as I mentioned before. And a lot of the Christianity combines these local traditions that have existed in that part of the world for centuries before the arrival of Christianity. And so, again, if you want to create a message of Christianity being a universalizing religion, what do the people who already, what do they believe there already? And what do you have to offer in terms of what you can teach and help to better their lives through the religion and so forth, and how you can blend the two to kind of bridge those ideas. And so, just like where other places we talked about the blending of cultures, this is another way in which it happens here in Axum. And so they kind of combine the animal ancestral veneration and the belief of spirits with Christianity, and they built 11 massive churches from rocks and such. And here's an example of one. Here's one of their churches. This is what it looks like from above. And this is all stone. This is like, I don't know what kind of stone it is, but it's all stone. But somebody carved, many people probably, carved into the rock here, and they carved this in making one building from this large stone structure into a church. So this is what it looks like below. So this is the top, and this is below. It's a really, really cool artifact or a heritage site, but it definitely shows you the amount of influence that Christianity has on Ethiopia, because who would take this time to do something of this magnitude if it didn't have an enormous amount of meaning to them? This is another one of those churches. While its story is, as far as the building goes, not as interesting as this one, what this building represents is pretty fascinating themselves. And so for those of you, know what the Ark of the Covenant is and don't know what the Ark of the Covenant is, it is the resting place of the broken tablets of the Ten Commandments. And so if you ever watched Indiana Jones, I think it's the first Indiana Jones and such, they go try to find it. And, that's just a movie, but in the folklore of Ethiopian Christianity, it is believed that the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant is in this building, and that the man right here in the yellow is the only one allowed in. You see this gate right here where there's only, basically divides, the outside from the in. The only person allowed inside this building and inside this gate is this guy in the yellow, the caretaker. And so he watches over it, but it is believed that by the local folklore and such, that the Ark of the Covenant is in this building. Whether it is or not is not for me to say. It's just what people believe. So we can't ignore Africa or talk about Africa and ignore the fact that something else that has been going on in practice, that it has later implications when we talk about the world history curriculum, is slavery. And slavery has a long history in Africa. It exists prior to the arrival of the Europeans, but when the Europeans get to Africa, they exploit it and expand on it much bigger than what it had been. So oftentimes, slavery was a way for prisoners of war. They'd be used prisoners of war for slavery. They were used to, pay off debts, to voluntarily put you or your family into slavery to pay off debts. It was used for criminals. But the jobs of slave is mostly for agriculture. They work the land and so forth. And at that point, that's essentially how the majority of the slaves were used, for those jobs that are very tough and labor intensive. So many kin-based societies, land can't be owned. Land is land. Land is there. It's for you to use, right? But people could be owned, and that is kind of where we have the beginnings of chattel slavery, where like one person's owned as property. You own more slaves, the higher your social status is. And so the desire to own more slaves is certainly got an incentive there. And then there were a lot of slaves that were in demand in other parts of the world, and particularly the Middle East, where Arab merchants would come and purchase slaves and bring back to the Arabian Peninsula, as well as into the Middle East, modern day Iraq, and so forth. And so there was very much an Indian Ocean slave trade that existed prior to when the Europeans started to get into a slave trade as well. And not to say that there weren't resistance to that slavery and that slave trade at that time. One good example is the Zanj Rebellion from 869 to 883. The Zanj Rebellion took place in where is kind of modern day Mesopotamia. And a slave that converted to Islam, Ali bin Muhammad, him and 15,000 followers end up rebelling and taking over an entire city and basically running it themselves for a good long time. It was considered one of the most successful slave revolts in history. There will be others we'll talk about, but know that even though slavery existed beforehand, there was also still resistance to slavery by those who were enslaved. This is a cultural thing to add on. This is not on the curriculum specifically, but just something to add as far as knowledge about the cultural influences in Africa. So griots are people who were basically storytellers, songwriters, and such, and they were hired to sing at weddings about stories of their past and so forth. Because of their knowledge of what's happened in the past and so forth, kings would ask for their counsel and everything, and but they would basically sing songs with instruments about the past and spread like a common sense of history amongst the people, and that's something that helps unite people in all parts of the world, is this common sense of history. And so that's something that occurred in Africa. So there it is, Africa in a nutshell. Guys like Ibn Battuta we didn't talk about, but we will at a later time in a later unit. And so here we go, Africa, the basics behind it and state building. So once again, think about what you just listened to and think about where there's similarities and differences. Are those similarities more so than there are differences, or is it the opposite when you answer your question, right? So that's it from here. I hope everyone's at home safe and healthy. I will see you all later.